panel. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite our esteemed guests up. So everybody can come up and take a comfortable seat up here with me. And I will make the introductions. Thank you, Lee. Yes. They gave us comfy chairs today, not uncomfortable stools. And I'm going to start first with Lee Malloy, who works with me here at Cox Automotive, but Lee is a part of our Mobility Solutions group and is actually the kind of key theme that, yes, we have a connection to all those companies. So I'm really leaning on Lee to help us understand how do we get this patchwork of people here today.
Yep. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, my name is Lee Malloy. I am part of Cox Automotive. I lead emerging technology within mobility, which is Cox Automotive's fourth and newest division. And much of the work that I do is focused on enabling our transportation future. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is what does that transportation future look like? And the way we describe it passionately is called this ACES future of transportation. And ACES stands for autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And each of us here today has an important role in shaping that future, and we look forward to talking more about it. In particular, my focus is enabling those autonomous, connected fleets to be able to maintain uptime and utilization as they become more and more of our client base. And that means new capabilities and services around the battery and battery health, charging infrastructure, but we're also taking a really close look at second life for the battery. So how can we help the industry as it evolves and more uses are required for the second life, whether it's energy storage or recycling. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the rest of the panel. To my left, Philip Dulfner. He's with Porsche. Philip leads corporate development and strategy and focuses on many of the topics that are of interest today, connected car, and so on. To his left is Nathaniel Hardiman. He is with the Center for Transportation and the Environment, focused on both policy and automation. Sam Bond is with Lyft. He is the regional director for the Southeast. And lastly, Lincoln Wood with Southern Company, focused on policy both at the federal and state level. And just as Jonathan mentioned, we're all focused in partnering together as we enable this transportation future and look forward to sharing our stories of how we're interconnecting along the way.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks for introducing everybody. But I wanted to give, because these are really different perspectives, all related to these trends and things that are happening, I wanted to kind of give each of you the opportunity to explain kind of what you think is most significant that you're seeing directly in the company or organizations you represent, and even kind of bounce back at any of the facts that we've talked about today, that what you think is most relevant for the crowd to understand. So Philip, you want to start?
Hello. Thanks for having me. I think we've talked about the facts, I think, around a year ago when you visited the Porsche office, and it's always really interesting insights. And one of the figures you showed was from 2018 about the intention to buy an electric vehicle. And luckily in 2019, we will launch an electric vehicle. So hopefully that has spiked. So we haven't seen that data point yet. But on a serious note, I think overall, over the next 2 years, you will see so much more availability of vehicles. And also with Electrify America and in general also the utilities ramping up the charging network, it will be a completely different landscape as compared to, say, 2 years ago. That doesn't mean that the consumer will automatically accept it, but it will be a completely new situation in terms of your buying experience. When you go to dealerships, you will actually have a good chance that you have an EV in the showroom. You can test drive one. There will be charging stations where you can charge them during the test drive. And depending on also what market segment you will look at, I personally think that the range anxiety and charging topic is maybe not as big as it is sometimes communicated, because when we look at our customers, the large majority has their own home. So once they have their 22 kilowatt charger in their home, I would not say that charging is not an issue anymore per se, but with a decent range and charging your vehicle at home every night, you at least have much, much less of an impact as a customer who lives maybe in New York City would have to charge at a public charging station and has a lot more complications around parking, for instance. So in a nutshell, I think we are off to an interesting start. I mean, Audi has also launched their car this year, and Mercedes and BMW and all the other companies in the premium segment will also join soon thereafter. But we just have to find out if the people like the concept, and that has always been the number one focus for us. We want to build a car that people actually like, because I'm sure that together with the other partners, we will make sure that the prerequisites are met, that they can actually operate it.
Thank you, Philip. So I think everyone in here is probably familiar with Porsche, Lyft, and Southern Company, and probably not so familiar with who we are, CTE, the Center for Transportation and the Environment. We're a national nonprofit based here in Atlanta that actually came out of DARPA in the mid-90s through Georgia Tech, developing hybrid electric Humvees for the U.S. military. And since then, we've been working on development and commercialization of clean energy tech for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, mostly through grant-funded programs, so very tied in with federal activities through the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and Department of Transportation. And more recently, and I'm glad Jonathan showed the dichotomy kind of between California and the rest of the country. We do a ton of work out in California, essentially as technical consultants and project managers for a lot of the clean energy tech development they're doing out there through the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission. And so in the next 2 years, if we're going to use that time frame, what we've been witnessing very rapidly is mandates coming down, not necessarily from the federal government at this standpoint, at this point in time, but certainly from states and municipalities pushing on their municipal agencies and statewide agencies to go zero emission using either battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell technologies. And so right now, CTE, we're working on about a third of all battery electric bus deployments in the country, all effectively grant-funded programs. We're starting to see a lot of agencies that are getting out in front of even their state leadership, who realize that this is probably coming in every state at some point. It's just a matter of when, not if. And so kind of following California's lead in the market, as California demand is driving costs down for battery electric buses and starting to develop a market for battery and hydrogen fuel cell trucks, everyone else is kind of reaping the benefits. So.
All right, and so at Lyft, we are really excited about the next 2 years for a couple of reasons, and they're tied to the issues around cost and charging. For those that don't know, Lyft operates a short-term rental program we call Express Drive, and that allows folks who want to drive for Lyft to do a week-to-week rental to be able to drive on platform. Over the last 2 years, we've added thousands of vehicles nationwide to that to our overall fleet that are all electric. But right here in Atlanta, we were the first market in the nation to bring electric vehicles into that rental fleet. And we've had 50 Chevy Bolts on the road since January of this year. And to date, we've done almost 1 million vehicle miles traveled in those cars since the start of the year, delivering people around Atlanta. And we're excited to continue expanding electric vehicles as part of our overall fleet and our rental fleet in particular. It's the right thing to do, so the environmental benefits, I don't have to convince anyone in this room. But on the point of cost, too, the point of entry for a lot of people may still be too high, even with the Leaf. And so in Atlanta, where a lot of our drivers don't necessarily come from some of the higher socioeconomic backgrounds, the ability to get exposure to an EV through a rental program with a low commitment is a phenomenal way to increase that visibility and get more people to experience that. And then those drivers are out performing often tens, if not hundreds of sort of opportunistic ride and drives every week. So in those 1 million vehicle miles traveled since the start of the year, they've given tens of thousands of rides to people in the Atlanta metro who may not have been exposed to an electric vehicle before. And so when you start to break down these, the we're going to see them everywhere, but not me, as Jonathan has mentioned. The more we can incorporate EVs into our fleet, the more we can start to get people that firsthand experience, which is so critical to understanding, hey, this is quieter, this is smoother, and oh, by the way, the savings that can be generated versus operating an ICE vehicle are really tremendous. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the next 2 years are going to be really exciting, we feel, at Lyft, not just here in Atlanta, but across the country.
All right, good afternoon. So can we do story time for just a second? Because I have 2 small kids and this is where my brain lives. So I'm going to level set for you. I was sharing with Lee earlier, a couple weeks ago, one of our VPs had this bright idea to put out a poster near our employee parking deck near the elevators and just ask an anonymous question with dry erase markers and have employees just kind of write answers as they walk by. And my colleagues, Daniel and Sarah, are both here. So both of them may have seen me walk by with some posters trying to hide them. So the first question we asked was, what prevents you from driving electric? So this is at the Georgia Power headquarters, and we have about 2,000 people based in that building. So over the course of a few days, we had several answers written in, and they ranged from student loans to the vehicle that I drive isn't offered in electric. I don't have the size that I need. I like to drive a pickup. We don't have it yet. But it's the same thing that Jonathan showed at the end of his presentation was cost and range anxiety. Why is that important? Because the Georgia Power parking deck has employee charging all throughout the deck. But range anxiety is still an issue for the employees who work there. So I thought that was really telling, one. And two, I think it goes to the role that Southern Company plays really across the entire Southeast around rolling out infrastructure. And I'll just kind of frame it for you how I generally try to come at that issue. Not to say this is the right answer, but this is kind of where Lincoln falls. One would be, yes, we absolutely need more charging infrastructure out. We need to try to speed up the adoption of that as much as we can. Two, the utilities have a major role to play in that, and that can be either from building out the infrastructure up to the make-ready stub, so that's kind of up to the pad, or owning and operating that whole piece of infrastructure, whatever that looks like. I don't know that the market has settled on a definitive answer yet for that. And third, this one you may know less about, and I'm going to ask a question. Who in here drives an EV? Okay, so I need to do a little explaining first. This third one talks about interoperability of the charging stations themselves. So 80% of charging for an EV, for a passenger EV, let's talk about that first, is done at home or at work. But for when you actually have to do a road trip, and I have a story I can tell you about that later, that you have to plug the charger in and you have to find where the charger is, and you have to have generally an app on your phone or an RFID card. Except for Electrify America, there's not really where you insert a credit card and pull it out and charge it. So what does that mean? That means there's a software network running on that charger. If for some reason the company that's running that network goes out of business or there's some other fault, interoperability ensures that you can put a different network on that charger. So if you're driving electric, that charger that you went to yesterday and it worked, today may have a different network on it, but it still works. If that doesn't happen, then basically you have what we call a bricked charger, meaning you can't charge anymore. So it's a different way of thinking about how you fuel the vehicle because you don't do it very much. But when you do it, it needs to work because you probably don't have range to get somewhere else. So I guess my third point would be we need to make sure that as we roll this infrastructure out, interoperability is a core component of what we think through as we build this out.
Well, since you went directly there and I started it, I'd love to hear the panel's perspective of what do you think is the number one thing that's holding back adoption, and what would you do to change it?
I can start with that, and I'll build off of a lot of Jonathan's intro and some of the research that Cox Automotive has put out to really understand consumer attributes and trends around EV adoption. And the one that resonates most with me in my role is the stat that for 83% of EV non-considerers, they are skeptical about the battery health. And what that tells us, especially in the secondary market, and what we know from a lot of our data, is that used battery electrics transact at a discount in the marketplace because there's not a great mechanism to communicate health to the consumer on a consistent basis. So in particular, that's a trend we're watching closely, but also one that we hope to take action on to start to communicate back to the industry on our consumer markets as well as our wholesale markets like Manheim, plus potentially our fleet platforms like Clutch, where Porsche and other clients are part of, how can we communicate back to the industry how healthy is this battery and drive confidence to understand what they're getting with the purchase and the associated range and or remaining useful life. So that's one segment of the overall consumer perception we're focused heavily on.
I think if you take the word anxiety, you understand what the problem is. I think anxiety comes usually from a lack of information, a lack of security, and what we can do as partners really is, as you just said, communicate the facts and educate people, and that at the same time is the challenge, because how many consumers can you convince for a 45-minute tutorial as to what you should consider before you even start the buying process, right? And part of this is also, when you talk about battery and the reliability, is to take the facts and information that we already have, because Tesla has been in the market for a while, the Lyft has been in the market for a while, like millions and millions of miles driven. Let's take those facts and show it to the consumers. And also the first vehicles, even also for us, that will be driven a lot, take these information, provide it to the people, whether it's in a dealership, whether it's the consumer itself, or also the media, in order to educate people about this. And I think that's one key thing that would reduce anxiety. But I think I would even attack it more proactively and more entrepreneurial. You would think that, from an attractiveness point of view, it needs to be just cool, and there needs to be an aspirational factor as to driving an EV. And that's exactly what we try to allude to when we launched the Taycan, essentially. It is a great vehicle. It drives really well. It has incredible acceleration. It looks fantastic. These are reasons I think we also want to push as manufacturers, because at the end of the day, that's also one of the reasons why you buy a car, especially an expensive one. There's many other different ways how you can move, right? I mean, take the example of Lyft. I could also just become a Lyft customer and not drive myself anymore. So in other words, let's push the positives and let's make people advocates. And that's something that costs time and energy, but I think commitment will definitely help.
So I think my perspective is a little bit different on this, simply because our customers are primarily either transit agencies or freight end users that are developing this, and range anxiety still is a massive, massive issue. The duty cycles are a lot more predictable, but the batteries are exceedingly heavy at at this point, and then uptime becomes a major issue as well. So if you need to keep things in operation for a long, long period of time throughout the day, a range of 180 miles isn't going to cut it, or an effective range of 150 miles isn't going to cut it, which is where a lot of these heavier duty batteries are right now. You can try doing fast charging, but then you're killing the battery life and you're destroying the economics behind that purchase, and you're ruining your total cost of ownership. Charging standards are still somewhat problematic. In the bus industry, they've only recently gotten all the major OEMs aligned in terms of how they would do not plug-in but opportunity charging, with overhead catenaries deploying and on rails at the top of the bus and doing a faster charging. So yeah, I mean, if I had to pick one though, it's still the range, and people really do not want to go out on a limb for this stuff. And when we do these fleet transition plans for agencies, looking at turning over hundreds or even thousands of buses, they still can't do one-to-one transitions. It's maybe 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 to meet the duty cycle of a single bus route, where they're going 400 plus miles in a day. So it's just that the technology is not there yet, but they're mandated to do it, and they're getting federal support for it. Not as much as they would like, but we're going to need it for the foreseeable future to push that transition forward. Sorry, you got that one there.
Steal the mic. Probably most important again is exposure. I think we talked a little bit about the consideration process for buying a new vehicle, and having gone through it recently, there's definitely the question of what type and should I consider an electric vehicle. I think the process and the willingness will really start to accelerate once the consideration starts upstream of the buying consideration, right? So again, back to how often can more people be exposed to these benefits and all the great things and the coolness factor of being in an electric car or driving one, what better way than for people to happen into an electric vehicle when they're taking a lift from Hartsfield or when they're kind of scooting across town and don't want to look for parking. And that's also where a partnership becomes big. And that's in our work with not just with Georgia Power but with Cox to try and help not only get the vehicles on the road, but also provide educational materials. So the cars that we have on rent in the Atlanta market have little window clings that say, did you know you're an electric vehicle? And it starts to list out some of the unit economic improvements and some of the environmental benefits of being in that car. And we're working at Lyft to incorporate some of the messaging into digital feedback, like in the app or on your ride receipt. Here's some of the benefits. Here's all the fuel consumption you've saved by riding in electric vehicles. And in certain markets, we actually have a specific mode we call green mode, which allows a passenger to open the Lyft app and request a specific subset of vehicles to be able to take their next ride, whether it's electric or hybrid. So all of these things are going to help improve with getting more visibility to that benefit and not just being told it or sort of having it resonate through an article or something else that's sort of tossed over the airwaves, but rather to really live it and experience it. And so we're really excited to continue driving that accelerated exposure as we bring more electric vehicles into our fleet.
So for me, you probably guess I would say infrastructure, and you'd probably an accurate guess. But I'd like to think about that in a little bit different flavor. So I drive the Chevy Bolt EV. So I have 238 miles of all-electric range. Last summer, I had a meeting in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and I thought, great, I'll drive my Bolt down. Except I can't, because there's no fast charging between here and Gulf Shores. It would have taken me 2 days to drive the car. It would have to charge fully overnight and then keep going. So when we think about building out the infrastructure, it's not just throwing a bunch of money and a bunch of infrastructure out there. It's being thoughtful about how we do it and why we do it. So at least 2 states in the Southeast, Tennessee and Florida, have different variances around a Drive Electric, Florida Drive Electric Tennessee organization, and it involves many different offices, from state offices to utilities to nonprofits. And for that very discussion around how are we going to do this, what are our goals, how does this move forward? And I bring that up because I always think about, with my experience of not being able to drive my Bolt to the beach, trying to think about how we position it so that we make the Southeast a better place for tourism, how to pull economic development opportunities forward. That, to me, to Sam's point of messaging around an electric vehicle, now how cool would that be if you thought, hey, I can drive my EV to the beach, or there's destination charging at such and such hotel. If I drive it there, I know I'll be able to charge if I get the car there. Things like that to make it not just, hey, drive an EV because you should drive an EV. But what are we trying to get to when we do that? And I feel like pulling that message forward will help us move the technology along.
Well, and I think that's an appropriate time for me to call an audible here, because when we were originally designing this panel, we really wanted to have the Public Service Commission represented to talk about what's going on with Georgia. But lo and behold, there was this little thing called a hearing over Vogel that was scheduled to take place today. So we gave up on the idea of having Tim Echols here. But lo and behold, the hearing lasted 2 hours yesterday, and they were able to finish that and to give us the opportunity for Tim to be here today. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of react to some of what you've been seeing happening in Georgia and to explain what some of those things that you see that we need to be doing.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Tim Echols. I'm Vice Chair of the Georgia Public Service Commission. We regulate energy in the state, and the nexus with EVs and our agency is that we do regulate Georgia Power, one of the units of the Southern Company, and we set tariffs, including their electric vehicle charging rates. We also allow them to rate base a certain amount of chargers in their rate base. So a couple things just to react. Philip, I tweeted out what Philip said because I just thought it was just so simple and so true. And it is that Porsche wants to build cars that people actually like. That is.
I would claim we have a few today.
Yeah. You do. Yes, and I've driven that Porsche Panamera e-hybrid You gave it to me for 2 weeks, and I put as many miles on it as I possibly could put on it as I drove it to our Clean Energy Roadshow. But, you know, what we discovered with the Nissan Leaf and the tax credit Georgia had was that Nissan Leaf, even though it wasn't a pretty Porsche, that mostly a majority of the folks that leased the car were men. And I thought it was interesting that a car that felt a little bit dainty was a car that men leased, and I think it boiled down to money and value, right? Is that car was essentially free. By the time you leased it for 2 years, you got the $7,500 tax credit baked into the lease, and then you took that $5,000, amortized it over 24 months. That was a $208 value. I leased 3 of them, 2 of them simultaneously, because it was such a great deal. My payment was only $269 for 2 years, and I'm getting $208 back. And then you turn around the gas savings that I had previously had on another car. Now I'm actually making money on this car. And so it was a car, I think, that really surprised a lot of us. And my family, we're all auctioneers. My dad started working for Manheim in the 70s, and we owned a car auction that Cox eventually purchased on Metropolitan Avenue, the Pivot facility. I worked as my first job at Beaudry Ford after college, so I have spent some time in the car business. So I do feel like that these numbers that you have shared with us, these 12 lessons, numbers don't lie. And that's a sobering thing. I work a lot with EV people that love these cars, that promote it. This breaks their heart because it just says that, you know, that the price and especially the charging is still a barrier. And I think it's one of the reasons that I leased all 3 of those cars is I was fearful that the technology would not hold up and I would be stuck with a bad deal. And I knew I'd never leased a car in all of my life. But then I leased 3 electric cars back to back because I was fearful about the investment. And I knew I could, hey, give it back to Nissan, give it back to Kia, and let them deal with it. And that's exactly what's happened. And Manheim certainly shipped out a lot of cars out of this Atlanta market to places like California. But to your point, Nathaniel, California is really the tip of the spear. I mean, Germany, about 60,000 electric cars. California, 600,000. California has all the levers of government moving for electric cars. And in Georgia, we're trying to regain that dominance that we had, and we're trying to convince my Republican colleagues that somehow that the ACES formula that Lee talked about, that this autonomous, and electric is going to somehow be together in the future. And if we want to be like we are the fintech capital of the U.S., if we want to be the East Coast capital of electric cars, we'll never surpass California. But if we want to be the East Coast, we got to get this ACES formula in front of people and let my Republican colleagues in the legislature see that there is a connection between those 4 things. So I salute you for looking at these numbers, very important. And Cox, you guys are so good with not only the numbers, but with the conditioning reports that you do to give dealers the confidence what I'm buying in Atlanta is exactly what I thought I was buying in Atlanta. And the fact that you guys are taking a chance on this, even with these numbers. I'm going, wait a second. Did the rest of Cox, who created the Pivot facility, did they see this presentation? Because it seems like you guys are out ahead of the numbers. But, that's one of the things I appreciate about this company here is that that they realize that sustainability and moving cities that are out of attainment with the EPA, like Atlanta, moving them forward with the leadership, like you're doing at that pivot facility, means something. And I just salute Lyft and Cox and Georgia Power for what they're doing in moving our city forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks for the commercial for Cox. And we've got, I think we could talk to this group all day and amongst ourselves, but I wanted to give the opportunity if there's any kind of questions, because we've touched on kind of what are the economics going on with ride sharing and the experience that I think is really interesting with Lyft, to all the different roles that each of us play. And immediately I've got a hand. So I've got runners with microphones. Mark over here, he was the first one to.
Testing. Getting back to the question about infrastructure, though, I think that's something that I find the most compelling issue, and probably the Achilles heel of the whole thing is the charging infrastructure. And what I'm hearing is there's discussion about it at the state level, but in my mind, it really needs to be a federal type of initiative for standardization of charging. I mean, not only what a service station should look like, because I mean, we're all used to gas stations where you pull through a pump or whatever. Obviously, with electric cars, all of that's kind of thrown out the window, and what are they going to look like so that they, logistically flow cars through them? What are the charging standards for the amp flow and everything else, and then also the plug-in itself? And is anybody working on that type of standardization? Because you point out, if you went down to the Gulf Shores and there's no place in Georgia for you to charge necessarily with a standardization, well, what if I need to drive to St. Louis, right? And so I'm going to go across multiple states. Is anybody looking at that, at a federal level? What should the charging infrastructure look like?
So I couldn't have paid you to ask that question. I had a conversation last week with DOE and the Vehicle Technologies Office up in DC, and I asked that same question of every utility has, our boundaries, and we're regulated within those, and we do what we can within that. But vehicles don't stay within those territories. Are we as a nation prepared? Has anyone thought through that? What does that mean? And DOE said, you know what, you're right. And we're not sure yet. We think we have an answer, but we want to bring some people together and talk about it. So the plan is, to my knowledge, for now, they will be hosting regional workshops around the U.S. in 2020, bringing together a diverse set of stakeholders in those regions. And at the end of it, there will be some sort of analysis produced on here are the gaps that we see nationwide and then regionally. My hope, Lincoln's hope, is that whatever that ends up being, that there's some sort of either grant money or some sort of funding that's appropriated to help fix whatever those gaps we find out are. I, in my head, have a pretty good idea of what I think they are, but it's one of those things where I need other people to also see the same things, and then bring their input, and then make sure we have everything all together. There's also many technical organizations. There's one in particular, I'm blanking on their name. They're based in the Netherlands. It'll come back to me in a second. Nope, not that one. So I'll say it this way. There is a group that Southern was actually a founding member of called the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. So that brought together utilities, it brought together EV charging companies, trade associations, and it brought together auto OEMs. And the whole point is a big tent approach, especially with utilities and OEMs. These are 2 century-old industries that haven't really had to talk to one another, and now we're having to figure out how we do that. And at the same time, most of the EV charging companies are startups. So then you put all these people in a room, and we all have to figure out how this works. But there are 2 kind of tranches of that alliance. One is policy, which I'm involved in. The other is technical, and it does very much what you ask of working through what are those technical standards so that networks work across one another, that maybe the physical hardware going into the car is standardized, because right now there's at least 3 different choices for light-duty EVs. By the way, did I mention we haven't even gotten to medium and heavy-duty electric transportation yet, because that's now a thing. And for what it's worth, I think for the more immediate impact to the network that Southern has, probably medium and heavy-duty Class 6, 7, and 8 trucks is probably the bigger deal. So yes, we're getting there. People are looking at it. I'm not a very patient person, and I try to be patient, so I wish we had an answer now. I could say it's this, and it's not yet. But just know we have plenty of people much smarter than I am working on it.
Maybe I can add something here. Electrify America is one of the nationwide networks, and if you look at the map and how they approach their site planning and what they need to cover, it is truly a national approach. And if you also look at Tesla's supercharger network, it is exactly the same thing, from a methodology perspective. And as you said, I think that is the core bone you need to just ensure that people can travel from A to B, no matter which state, municipality, utility company, whatever. So I think that will be a very, very good example of how that can work. But the important thing is that we supplement it with the local charging options, and that's exactly what these groups should be for. But lastly, I also want to say that the OEMs are definitely working together to find standards to build the cars right, because just the plug discussion around CHAdeMO and the other plug is pretty mind-blowing from a consumer perspective, because frankly they don't care, they just want a plug, right? And I think that's also on us to sort this out, and I actually believe that the OEMs will drive the charging companies in that sense also, because once they got the vehicle right and standardized, then it makes everything a lot easier.
Maybe just one more point on the infrastructure side. So I mentioned at the outset that the Atlanta market for Lyft was the first to bring EVs into our rental fleet. A lot of people at Lyft HQ in San Francisco were a bit surprised, sort of cocked eyebrow on why Atlanta? And it's a direct knock-on of the incentives and the investment that went into the tax credits that were talked about earlier and the already existing infrastructure that was in place. And so that was an enabler for us to actually be on the leading edge, as Commissioner Eccles said, to be one of the first markets to bring electric vehicles into a rideshare fleet in the country. It's also important to recognize that just those 50 vehicles had a material impact on the utilization of the chargers that are in the Atlanta market, so much so that we've had really robust ongoing conversation with Georgia Power, both about where is the next round of chargers going to go, where are these cars going at night, where are the rides being delivered, and how does that match up to where the infrastructure is. But it's going to take that iteration and being able to bring down the total cost of ownership and purchase of the EVs through policies like we've talked about, was a key enabling factor of us coming here. And the more we can do in the future, I think the more it'll help that virtuous cycle.
Thanks, Sam. Mark, you're the first guy.
Hey, it's Daniel Sexton from the Atlanta Fed. I was sort of, toying with this in my head, and I was just sort of wondering, I'm no engineer, but I'm kind of wondering why gas stations, like traditional gas stations, haven't put charging stations in them already. Because as I understand it, most of the profit margin from a gas station actually comes from the convenience store. And I'm kind of speaking off the cuff here. I'm not actually entirely sure that that's true, but if that is the case, then it seems to me that a charging station would just have people spend more time also in the convenience store. So I guess, has this ever been kind of brought up or thought about in this way? And if so, what are the points around it, and why aren't we seeing it yet if it is the case?
I can answer part of that just from an anecdotal. There was a piece put out by the NPR a couple weeks ago that told the story of a gas station in Virginia that had just made that commitment to transform from a gas station to a charging station. And anecdotally, it was interesting that the driver of that financial commitment was the gas station's owner's daughter, who was 17 years old and was convincing her father that this is the way of the future. But there's some bigger business model pieces at play when you think about charging infrastructure, and we've touched on a lot of them, but utilization is a really big piece of it. Gas stations, a pump is typically utilized 15% of the time. Utilizations at charging infrastructure is something that the industry is still trying to figure out. How can we place chargers at locations that will be utilized by the public that has battery electric? I think technological innovation, something else that we've talked about, is also a bit of a constraint potentially right now as form factor changes from the increased energy that's available to be passed to the vehicle, as well as the emergence of inductive charging or wireless charging. As well as the frothiness of competition that we see in the charging infrastructure space, both with hardware options as well as software and network options. So I believe that potential exists and will be realized over time, but there's some difficult forces providing headwinds, I think, against that transition.
In the spirit of being fair and balanced, we had a question on this side of the room.
Hello. Joe Monica with Integritas. What are the official numbers on the average cost to fill up a combustible engine, gasoline prices factored in, and the cost of charging a car or the incremental electricity costs for the consumer? Thank you.
We've got research that was recently published, again, as part of our Cox Automotive Path to EV Adoption. And in general, we found that the cost to own a battery electric was about 58% less than a gasoline vehicle. And when you unpack that, the cost to charge, or the cost of charging versus fuel, was about 60% less for a battery electric, and the maintenance was about 25% less. So I think the consumer theoretically understands that opportunity, but there's still barriers potentially with access to charging.